40,000 bison, stopped. The old bull at the front of the herd had not moved in 6 hours. He stood at the edge of the frozen river, his breath coming in slow clouds, his massive head lowered in the specific posture of an animal attending to something no one else could detect. Behind him, as far as the eye could reach across the white prairie, the herd waited. Not restlessly, the way a held breath waits. The researchers watching from the ridge had never seen this. In 11 years of studying this crossing, they had never seen one animal hold back 40,000. What the old bull had sensed in that ice, and what he was waiting for, was about to prevent a catastrophe that no one on that ridge had instruments to predict. This is what happened the day the bison crossing stopped. Dr. Sarah Okafor had been studying the Northern Preserve's bison herd for 11 years. She had seen the winter crossing many times, the movement from the northern grazing areas to the southern plateau, driven by snow depth and feed availability. Every year, the same bend in the river. Every year, the same reliable ice. This January, the lead bull, a large, older animal she called Bull 1 in her notes, had been standing at the bank since 9 in the morning. It was now 3 in the afternoon. Behind him, the herd was backed up 2 kilometers. She had done the temperature check, -18 at the surface. Ice should have been solid. It looked solid. No cracking, no visual weak points, normal opacity. She had walked out to inspect it that morning. And yet Bull 1 had not moved. She watched him through her scope. His posture told her he was processing sound, not sight, head slightly lowered, ears forward, the position a bison takes when it is attending to something below the threshold of human hearing. He stood like that for hour after hour, with the patience of an animal that has been reading frozen rivers his entire life and is in no hurry to be wrong about this one. At 4 in the afternoon, she made the call she'd been weighing all day. She drove down from the ridge and walked onto the ice herself. She pulled out her ice chisel, her measuring tape, her headlamp. She drilled 5 test holes across the center line of the crossing. What she found stopped her. The top layer of ice was solid, clean, dense, exactly what she'd expected. But 22 centimeters down, the chisel behavior changed. A faint sponginess before the material gave way. She pulled out a core sample and held it to her headlamp. The stratification was unmistakable. The top 22 centimeters, clear and dense. Below that, 8 centimeters of a different material, cloudy, crystalline in a way that spoke of partial thaw and refreeze. Not a continuous cold formation. A weak layer buried under a solid surface. She drilled for more holes. The pattern was consistent across the entire crossing. She came back to the bank and sat in her truck for a while. The ice looked right. It measured right by total depth. But structurally, under the weight of 40,000 animals crossing in rapid succession, the middle layer would separate. The top surface would hold the first animals, the first dozen, maybe 15. Then it would go, fast and wide. The ice engineer she brought in 3 days later would estimate 40 to 80 animals lost in the initial collapse. Bull 1 had been standing at the bank all day, pressing the soles of his feet against ground he'd crossed dozens of times before, feeling something that her instruments only found when she went looking for it. She called her field station. She requested a drone flight and a thermal survey. Then she sat and watched Bull 1 in the fading light. He had not moved. The thermal drone flight the following morning confirmed what the core samples had shown. The stratified layer ran across the entire traditional crossing zone. A structural weakness invisible from the surface, undetectable without drilling, but present beneath every meter of ice that the herd would have used. Sarah filed an urgent request with Preserve Management to suspend any activities that might push the herd toward the crossing. She flagged the traditional crossing point as structurally compromised. She requested the ice engineer, but Bull 1 had already made his own assessment. That night, before dawn, before Sarah returned to the ridge, he moved. He walked south along the bank. Not toward the crossing. Away from it. 300 meters further downstream, around a shallow bend where the channel was wider and the current accordingly slower. A section she had never seen used. When she arrived at first light and trained her scope on the crossing location, the herd was gone. She scanned downstream, found them. The crossing was already in progress, not at the traditional bend, but at the wider section. Bull 1 was on the far bank. Behind him, the herd was streaming across in an orderly column, moving with the efficiency of a group that had made a collective decision and was executing it. She watched for 90 minutes. 40,000 animals crossed. The ice at the new location held without a single crack. The following day she drilled the new crossing point. 47 to 52 centimeters of uniformly solid, unstratified ice. No guiclair. No refreeze event. Ice that had formed slowly and cold, exactly as it should. She stood in the middle of the river and looked downstream at the traditional crossing. Still intact, its flaw sealed below the surface, and then at the new crossing point where 400,000 hoofprints were already filling with snow. She wrote in her field notes that evening. The lead animal detected a structural anomaly via sensory input we cannot replicate instrumentally. He delayed the crossing for 9 hours, identified an alternative route, and initiated a crossing that resulted in 0 casualties. This is the first documented instance in this preserve's history of the herd deviating from the established crossing point. She paused, then added, "It should not be the last thing we note about it." The ice engineer's report came back 2 weeks later. His casualty modeling was precise. Collapse at the 12th to 15th animal in close succession.
Rapid widening.
Animals already committed to the crossing, unable to reverse. He included a single editorial note at the end of his report, which engineers rarely do. The lead animal's assessment of this crossing was more accurate than any instrument assessment available at the site on the day in question. The preserve's crossing records were updated the following season. The traditional crossing point was reclassified from primary to conditional, subject to ice core verification before use. The new downstream site Bull 1 had identified was added to the monitoring map with the notation. First used winter crossing, initiated by lead male. Sarah Okafor continued her research. The following winter she added ice core sampling to her pre-crossing protocol. A new procedure, justified in her methodology update as a response to the previous year's anomalous conditions. She did not describe it in any official document as something a bison had taught her to do, but that was the order in which it had happened. She thought about that sometimes, about the gap between what she had been measuring for 11 years and what Bull 1 had been reading. She had good instruments and careful methods and a substantial archive of behavioral data. She had not, until that January, spent much time considering what the herd knew that she didn't. Bull 1 returned to the crossing the following winter. He walked to the bank of the river. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he stepped onto the ice and the herd followed, and the crossing went without incident at the traditional point, which that year was solid and uniform all the way across. Sarah watched from the ridge and wrote it all down. Some years the ice is right. Some years it isn't. What changes year to year is which of those years you're in, and Bull 1 in 14 winters of crossings had not yet been wrong about which was which. She filed her notes. She drove back down the ridge. Somewhere on the far side of the river, 40,000 bison were spreading out across the southern plateau, feeding in the winter grass, doing what they had always done. The river froze and thawed and froze again behind them. It would be there next winter, and the winter after that. And Bull 1, if the years were kind to him, would come back to read it.